Hello, everyone, and welcome to Beginnings, the show that asks, where do creative people come from? My name is Andy. I'm the host of the show and a writer and performer based in Los Angeles, California. California. How is everyone doing? Doing a real speed run through Nazi Germany right now. Did not think we'd get to American Dachau in month 3, but here we are. And here I am, humbly hoping that this episode gives you some respite from the absolute fascist hell out there right now. I have personally been mainlining Blank Check, Freedom, a wonderful improv podcast called First Hand, a bunch of others, just not to deny what is going on, but I can't read the news 24/7. I gotta give myself an hour or two, or in the case of Blank Check 3, respite. And if today's episode doesn't give you some relief from the storm, why, folks, I'll eat my hat, because today I am talking to John Davis. And if you don't know who John is, I'm going to read you his bio right now. Growing up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, musician John Davis formed the folk Implosion with Sebadoh and Dinosaur Jr.'s Lou Barlow in the early 1990s. Their first album, 1994's Take a Look Inside, was a brilliant lo-fi pop record. I remember getting that around the same time, I don't know about exactly, but around the same time that I got Silver Jews, the Arizona record. And I was like, oh, you can do this? You can just record music no matter where you are? And if the songs are good, people will enjoy it? Where was I? Their first album, 1994's Take a Look Inside, was a brilliant lo-fi pop record. And then a year later, a song of theirs on the Kids soundtrack blew up. And in the diverse atmosphere that had been created in Nirvana's wake, the band was noticed by a number of larger labels. Their third album would be released by Interscope, after which John left the band. As a solo artist, John has released many albums under different names on labels like Shrimper, wonderful record label. Anyway, I'm taking too many tributaries to what I do this bio. Just last year, Lou and John got back together to make a new folk Implosion album. Walk Through Me was released on Joyful Noise last June, and it is quite wonderful. Highly recommended, folks. And John himself highly recommended. This is a lovely conversation through growing up in Cambridge, the school he went to there, where I think we talk about Evan Dando also went to that same school, politics, of course, and a lot of other things. I won't belabor this intro. I'll just say John's a cool dude. Coming up on the show, a lot of great episodes. Tina Halliday from Sheer Mag, Kristen Hirsch from Throwing Muses, David Longstreth from Dirty Projectors. I also talked to Kelly Sue DeConnick, a fantastic comic writer. So look forward to those. Stay safe in the fascist storm. And now, let's talk to John.
Are you sporting an Ebbsfield Flannels hat?
I am.
I know that hat. I've thought of ordering it, but my head is too big for any of their hats, they told me.
This is a great hat. I got to say, so during the strikes in 2023, I realized I needed a head cover. If I'm going to be walking around Paramount or Netflix for hours a day in the hot sun, I need a head covering.
Yeah.
I bought a bunch of hats, and I'm not like a sports guy, and I'm not... I don't know. They don't make a lot of hats. They just started recently making like indie rock hats. Like I got a Guided by Voices hat. But
right.
I got a bunch of these Ebbsfield hats. They are the best.
They're so cool. I have a bunch of their... I don't have any of the hats, but I have some T-shirts and some jackets. I have some of their grounds crew jackets. And I love their website. I love what they do. I love how whimsical they are, but also grounded in history of different places. It's a great. Where was that team located? The Cats? I forget. I was trying to remember. I think was it the Kansas City Cats or something like that?
Yeah, something like that.
The minor league team.
I enjoy playing.
It's more
sports,
about the hat, yeah.
But I don't watch sports, and I especially do not know beyond the history of what I need to know in terms
Yeah.
of sports. So I just went through and I'm just like, that's cute. That's cute. And I'm like, oh, they have it in my size? Great. Here we go.
Okay, I feel that. Yeah, for sure.
Are you a sports guy?
Just baseball, really. I was a sports guy, and getting to how I got here, I was really into sports until I got to high school. Well, I was into basketball a lot in junior high, and I wasn't taller. And then I got to a high school where I was in very small school, and it wasn't cool to like sports there, and it was cool to like punk rock. And so that's when I stopped playing sports or watching it so much. It was sort of like, you can't listen to Van Halen and U2 anymore, and you can't talk about sports all the time. You have to like listen to Husker Du and the Replacements and shop at the Army Navy store and buy this year's model and punk it up. And
Hold on. When you say was cool, do you mean that like the school recognized it as cool, like the popular kids, or do you just mean like the avant edge of the people that you wanted to hang out with? They were the ones that thought that was cool.
So I went to this small private school that my dad taught at. So I went on scholarship, and it was kind of a refuge for people that weren't good at sports. So you would kind of go there if you would get beat up at another school.
Oh.
So like there were a lot of like math, science kind of people that were kind of would get teased for being geeks. And then there were a lot of, so it's kind of like a geeks and freaks kind of scene, small school. And so like, we weren't good at sports back then, and we were proud of it. And I would try, and when I did have to go to sports after school, I'd try and lose really fast so I could go to the used record store, and there's a band called the Lemonheads that started there, and they were seniors when I was a freshman. A lot of those people were older brothers of those people were like college radio DJs locally, and so it just was kind of, it was not like it was the what the popular kids at that particular school did, in good and bad ways.
Yeah, wait, what was the name of it? Because Evan was on the show before, and I don't remember him having a particularly good time there.
Commonwealth, yeah. He talks about Commonwealth a lot in interviews. I haven't seen him in years, but he had my dad as a teacher, and I was a freshman when he was a senior, and he taught me to play a couple replacement songs in the hallway, and we were very different people, though.
Yeah, I get that.
Yeah.
I get that just from the couple minutes we've been talking already.
Right. I'm not gonna, but anyway, but yeah, I don't. I teach fourth grade, so I hear a lot about sports from students, and I keep up with it to be able to hold a conversation with them to a point. But I do still like baseball. That when I was young in the 70s, the Red Sox were very good, and the Celtics and the Patriots were really bad. And so nobody, I think if I had been 10 years younger, I might have been more like into the Celtics, because then Larry Bird came along in the 80s. But by then I was sort of, so I was never, I also just like, but I also felt, I was an introvert and kind of, so I never was like totally into sports, but I can go there to connect to people if I have to.
Yeah. But there's also something in the 70s, I'm going to say this, and I didn't exist at the time, so this is just my perception of it from later on in life. Like, baseball was kind of, there was still a little hippie-ish edge. I just remember there being like a baseball card of like some Pittsburgh player who was like had a giant mustache, and then there was some story of another guy pitching on mushrooms. Like, there was some kind of like, I don't want to say counterculture exactly to baseball, but like something there. Am I wrong?
No. I mean, I think that my father's favorite baseball player was Bill Lee, who was kind of like a hippie baseball player that was on the Red Sox at the time. And that's Bill Lee is active with the Savannah Bananas today. I don't know if do you know about the Savannah Bananas? It's
No.
like a kind of like a barnstorming baseball team, like the Harlem Globetrotters of baseball, but like they have modified rules and they've become incredibly popular. Like they sell out major league stadiums when
Wow.
they go, and it's kind of a carnival, and they have people doing crazy things like pitching on stilts, or like if a fan catches a foul ball, it's an out, and like it's kind of like but it's a lot of former major league players play in it, and Bill Lee's one of them. And a friend of mine who's done some videos for us and for me is their videographer, and so I hear a lot about them because he's followed them around filming them and is making a movie about them. And you know, I mean, I think I got from my father, was a big baseball fan, but was like teased for not being a jock as a kid. So, you know, in suburban New Jersey, you know, and so I inherited that dichotomy kind of from him, you know, but there were very much like kind of, you know, there was that kind of, you know, kind of rougher around the edges aspect to 70s baseball culture. And a lot of the names were really weird and cool, you know, like Raleigh Fingers, or
That's exactly what's in my head. Raleigh Fingers, yeah.
Viola Blue, or, you know, like yeah. So it was I remember driving to New York from Boston and reading the book The Bronx Zoo, which was about the Yankees and just about crazy behavior there. And yeah, it was you know, they weren't making the kind of money that they are today. So I think that the kind of there were more like approachable sense of like the relationship between the sports writers that would write about those guys and the players. Like I remember like Fredlin saying in an interview once that they would eat at the same restaurants as the people writing about them because they didn't make that much more money than them. And today, you know, that they're, you know, sort of that multimillionaire culture of like having private chefs and traveling. I just think it's a different, the amount of money that's involved is so much greater now than in the 70s, that there's a sort of, that invites a more kind of, you know, conservative culture, I think, around baseball. And like, you're less likely to go out carousing if you've got X million dollars on the line. If you,
Yeah, of course. And also there's, it when you say conservative, it's not just like conservative in terms of like, we're not with the people. It's also in terms of like, it's also like very conservative in terms of like politically, it's very conservative. You know, in this, I forget what I was reading the other day, but you know, just the number of sports figures, like even Muhammad Ali, right, who spoke out about political injustice in the 60s and into the 70s, it absolutely eclipses. I mean, I can't think of a single person outside of, who's the name of the kicker? Chris Kluwe, is that his name?
For the Vikings, that guy?
Yeah, who's
spoke out on LGBTQ stuff and stuff like that. I think
there's like two people, maybe like three that speak out now.
Yeah, I think, you know, yes, I think there's a sort of, there's a lot of censorship going on in those spaces. And I think an NBA player spoke out about Palestine and got censured they got a call from the league president the next day or something. And so, yeah, I just think that, you know, it's hard to imagine someone like Bill Russell playing, you know, I don't know. It's just a different, it is a more kind of speak to the script kind of era of that sports culture. But I do like baseball because I can watch it in the background while I'm doing schoolwork and feel less resentful that I'm working at night.
There's something about, I think one of the reasons why I feel alienated from sports is the money part of it. I don't feel like they are in the same world as I am. And it's interesting that you grew up in an era where it felt like the people playing baseball or basketball or whatever did live in the same world as you.
Well, they also just look different. Like if you look at an NBA game and that's related to the money, right? Like the amount of money you have to spend on, like, you know, dietary
Sure.
weight training, personal trainers. It's just that they looked more like regular people, and I'm not to be a like jerk and be like everything was better when I was a kid, because they were also getting ripped off, right? And so like the players unions have made progress but there's also a lot of like there's this website called Field of Schemes that's about sports stadium corruption and like about how a lot of most teams, and unless you're like the New York Yankees or the Red Sox or something, it's really popular, would actually be losing money if it weren't for public subsidies. So if you how would I do as a teacher if I said, you can move to my city and I'll build a house for you and you don't have to pay for it and you never have to pay taxes on it. You can live there forever. Like, how much wealth could I accumulate? So if like you're a sports team and they build a stadium for you and you never have to pay any taxes, and there's this theory you're going to bring jobs into the community, like that's where a lot of the sort of bad side of the mushrooming of the amount of money in sports comes from. That kind of like the same thing as like, oh, Home Depot's going to move here and they're going to bring jobs to the community, so we won't ask them to pay taxes.
Yeah.
And so they put all the local hardware stores out of business. So that the whole process, and just the way that so much of like the talk about the game is about the contracts, I find alienating. So it's sort of like one thing that they make that kind of money, but like you turn into like ESPN or something and be like, well, he's only making $9 million this year, so he's not really that motivated. I'm just like, you know what? I don't want to listen to this. Just like, or like it's a contract year for him. So, or just like, and I know that there's people like I was reading this morning, like some company, what is it, that's not paying, like the CEO of Starbucks made $113 million this year or something. So like, an athlete making, I don't know, superstar athlete making in the 20s or 30s, that's not the top of the society, but it's just a different, the kind of, it's a shocking place value difference, that to most people. And I think, that's part of why people like the Savannah Bananas so much, is it's sort of in minor league baseball. I think minor league baseball players are the opposite. I think they're underpaid, and they're kind of, but I like going to Durham Bulls games because you can get a ticket for $8. And, I was on a solo tour before the pandemic, and me and Justin went, I was like, I can go to a Cubs game. I've never been to Wrigley Stadium, and it was really fun, but it was just like really, really expensive, and I was just like, wow, that was pretty cool, but was that worth like, $50 ticket to sit in the back of the bleachers? I was just like,
right.
I don't know. So it's just, it's that kind of, I guess it corresponds to, there's a Black Studies scholar I follow called Jared Ball, was like, well, it's one thing to be able to legally be able to have lunch in any restaurant you want, but if it costs $25 instead of $250, maybe you can't afford to eat there. That's sort of how things roll now,
Right. Well, this is the thing where you were like, I don't mean to say when, things were better when I was younger. I do think after a certain year, and whether we want to call it like maybe the start of the neoliberal period in the 70s or what, things did steadily get worse through our lifetimes from, let's say, the mid-70s to now. I do think it is a decline, so that you can say, and I don't mean this in a way where people are just, people will say that SNL was better when you were 12.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That I find to be completely nonsensical. Because I think there were different periods of SNL that were good and different periods of SNL that. However, in America, at the very least, I think there has been a steady actual decline from the 70s until obviously now, where it's just absolutely like we're on that, if not fascism, edge of it.
Yeah, I think in terms of like distribution of wealth and class, that's definitely true. I mean, I think, there's that sort of, thing I taught that to my students at one point this year about like, in the early 70s, if the average worker was inflation adjusted, making like $50K, and the average CEO of their company was making $2 million.
Yeah.
Now the average worker is still making exactly the same, and the CEO is making $20 million. So the wealth gap has grown by tenfold.
Right.
And so there's been all this increased productivity, but it's being shoveled up to the top. And I think also just, union density has gone down, loss of, I think in terms of like, until recently, like conversations about representation and race and LGBTQ stuff, I remember being a kid and having teachers that I found out later were gay that would have been fired if they'd come out of the closet, and until, I think some things have gotten better, but I think that, I think there's a lot of, until recently, touting of like different groups being represented more broadly in popular culture doesn't necessarily mean those groups are materially, as a whole, better off. I think like sort of if you can become Pete Buttigieg or something, like you couldn't be Pete Buttigieg and be an out gay man in the government, in the 70s, but for the majority of people who are working class, just it's harder to. There are more people struggling with things like medical bankruptcies and, and just like loss of benefits and,
Yeah. I think about representation a lot, especially because I am in Los Angeles. And it feels a lot of times like that because it costs nothing to allow. When I say allow, I mean for like the people, the ruling class, let's just call them, or like whoever's in charge of like a studio or whatever. It costs them nothing to hire someone who's gay or someone who is trans or someone who is black instead of white, right? It costs them nothing. So they are okay with that. But if there's any kind of, but the minute that, and in fact, it's honestly cheaper in many cases. It's honestly cheaper. So they're fine with that. But the minute that anyone who's non-white asks for equality, especially financial equality, then the teeth turn on them. And then they're like, no, get out of here. And then we'll hire Mel Gibson instead. Like, it's really.
Yeah. I think there's this sort of sense. I mean, in like one world I know is like, I chose to become a public school teacher eventually. But like when I started, it was easier for me to break into private schools because my parents had taught there. And like when you apply to a lot of those schools and you see their catalogs, the ratio and the images in the catalog might make you think that like 30% of the school is people of color, right? And then you go there and you actually walk around the campus and, that's the percentage is much lower than that. And so I think that increased representation is really important. And like I think that positively affects students. I taught in a lot of ways. And I think that the removal of that with what's going on now is damaging. But I also think it was used sort of appropriated and misused to prevent people asking questions about where the money's going.
Yeah, and there's also this that I've seen where representation is okay as long as they stick to as long as whoever that we're talking about, whether they're queer, whether they are black or brown, as long as they are mouthpieces for the white establishment.
Well, look at Colin Kaepernick. Colin Kaepernick's a classic example,
Right.
Like he's, he got on the cover of Time for it, but they never let him back in the league. And now, like, that's what effect will that have on, people like Lamar Jackson or, Patrick Mahomes or whatever. And like, I think that, so there is, it's a really strategically effective move that's been made, but it is very like, there's like a producer for the Real News Network in Baltimore he's passed away, but he was member of the Black Panther Party in the 60s and, wrongfully incarcerated, and he got out and he was shocked. He was to see how much worse off Baltimore was than when he was locked up like 40 years before. And he was like, all the boarded up houses and stuff. And he was like, because I'd been sent away before the industrialization happened. And he was like, I remember these neighborhoods with all that houses were occupied and stuff. And I got out and I was like, WTF, like what's going on? And just like he hadn't seen that whole transition you're talking about from the late 70s. He'd been inside. So when he got out, and he was just like, well, for working class people, black people, we've got a long way to go to get back to 1968.
Yeah.
And we may have, like, if you can, make it out of that class, you may have, you've got opportunities that didn't exist previously, but, most people, aren't famous or, in those echelons. And so I think that, that's definitely like kind of censored in the sense even prior to today's real censorship of like, you're not going to get funded to make, things that talk about that in mass media so easily.
Yeah. By the way, I'm not poo-pooing representation. I am just saying that it is often, the white establishment often allows it only as a cost-effective way of placating people.
Yeah.
As long as they're muzzled. So that's the part. That's the kind of like a muzzled representation is what I'm criticizing. Just so we're clear. Just so you know.
Yeah, and it's important to say that as for me, like as a white person, but I also think that sometimes people go too far, and they'll be like, I've got a lot writing on these questions. Like here in North Carolina, they're trying to take away our healthcare and retirement as teachers. And I'm currently teachers that start now don't get that. So if you were hired here after 2021, you're going to get no healthcare when you retire, even if you work in the district for 25 years.
Oh, you have a two-tiered system.
So I'm grandfathered in, right? But person next door over from me, and they retire if they stay. That's. If we don't speak out about how these dynamics, we're just going to we won't win these things. And
right.
So I think that it's a weakness there's a sort of tendency in a lot of I think you have to advocate for things that are important to you that materially affect your life. And sometimes these kind of strategies are being used to defeat people wanting to be compensated fairly for the work they do.
Yeah. Well, this is something I've been talking about on the show in the last 5 years, where I've really come to the conclusion that aesthetics and ethics are deeply entwined. And I'm curious, did you grow up with this kind of, your parents, you said, were teachers in private schools. Did they have this kind of ethical belief? Is it something that you came to only when you became a teacher and you kind of and worked in public schools? Like, where did your moral beliefs come from?
I think it was in the air in the neighborhood I grew up in, and I think that my parents did have it. I think that they were probably overly hopeful about how much art could make political change. I think they were very invested in, more like they were English teachers, right? So I was very much in my 30s. One reason I quit music and got really disillusioned was it was almost like I was like, I don't want to be an artist like my parents encouraged me to be. I'm going to rebel, And I was just like, I don't want to do this, and like a lot of musicians are going against their parents, right? And I feel like my parents, I grew up in a hippie neighborhood, my dad liked the Fugs and the Mothers of Invention and, the Ornette Coleman, and gave me like Rolling Stones albums. And my mom was like, introduced me to John Fahey's music and was like, really encouraging. Bought me my first guitar that I did a lot of the stuff I did in the 90s on. So like I was very encouraged to do something creative, and that was seen linked to political change. I don't think they weren't like radicals, but I think that the schools they taught at were very kind of crunchy, progressive kind of places. So like my dad taught like Noam Chomsky's kids, and my mom taught like Jill Stein's kids. So like those kind of private schools,
Oh,
like
wow.
So I mean, those places also have people going through them that are more conservative. A Republican in those schools was like a Martian, like you just didn't see them, And I think that all the same, they were very elitist spaces, and I think that I felt very kind of weird being, I got, socialized into those spaces, but I was one of the few people that wasn't really wealthy in those places. And private school teachers' money actually tend to make less money than public school teachers. So,
Really?
yeah, like because the benefits aren't as good. You don't get the same kind of, it's more like a 401k kind of thing versus like one reason I'm staying in the state public system is like, you actually get like a pension for the rest of your life, And so like my mom's a retired teacher and most of the money she's able to live on is from my stepfather being a public school principal as opposed to her private school 401k kind of thing, which is sort of petered out. So I think that, and times when I've been disgruntled about the way I'm treated in DPS and I've thought of quitting, going to a private school here in Durham, I would actually make less money. So I haven't done it. But yeah. I think that, not by, a huge amount less money, but less money. But I think that, I definitely kind of, before I started going to school, I wasn't in that situation. And once I started going to school, I was sort of, didn't really know a lot of people that had the same amount of money I did. And so that was kind of had its conflicts. And, I don't want to say exaggerate the degree to which, but it was kind of a situation that affected me a lot. And so I think it had to do with like when I started teaching in my 40s and tried private school for a few years, I was like, when I was just trying to get into it, it's easier to start getting internships there. But I was like, I don't want to stay here because I feel like I'm seeing kids that are scholarship kids going through what I went through. And there's a friend I have who's one of my favorite hip hop artists, Mike Ladd, that went to elementary school with me. And he married someone who was from France. And he said he moved there in part because he didn't want his kids to have, as a person of color, to have the choice he had of like either being one of the one or two black kids in a private school class or being like going to an underfunded public school. Mm-hmm. And so he moved to Paris with his wife, who's French and had citizenship. And he's like, yeah, here, like, school funding isn't determined by local property taxes. So you don't have to be like, oh, I have to move to Wellesley, with the rich people to get a well-funded school. It's sort of, and so that worked out for him. But, I think there are other ways that he said in France, they don't have the same kind of, like if you move to France from West Africa or something, you don't get French as a second language legally provided the way we do here for at least at this point until they take it away. But like, there are things that are, there are things that are better about, American schools in other ways. He said they don't talk as much about social issues in French schools, but they are better
Interesting.
funded, which I was surprised by that.
Because they seem much more aware in France. You see that like they're the government tries to take away like something minor and people rebel in a way here that everyone is very much mollified by the treats that they get. Yeah,
I think that must come from union culture being more prevalent there rather than schools. I mean, when I was there, I went with Mike Ladd on a we did a week of shows in Europe, and I flew to meet him in Paris, and my luggage got left behind, so I didn't have any good. And so we were at the airport trying to complain to them. And like, I was like, I'm playing Paris tonight. I'm flying to Stockholm tomorrow. What am I? Where's my stuff? How are you going to get it to me? And the airplane person was like, I don't know. What do you want me to do? It's in Atlanta. They missed the flight. It's on the next flight. And Mike was like, this is when the Yellow Jacket stuff was happening. Mike goes up in his face. He's like, this is why people are down there smashing windows in like central Paris, is because these big companies they're not accountable. They don't give. And he's like, well, later today I meet you down there, smash some windows with you. So no one that ever works for Delta would ever be allowed to say that.
Right.
Like, I know what you mean. I'll be down there later today with you. So I think they shut shit down, in a lot of these other countries, and in a way that doesn't happen in the same way here. So it's just pros and cons. But yeah, I mean, I think I liked getting into music in some ways because, it was a very, obviously indie rock's a very white genre, but just in terms of social class and economic background, it wasn't as elite. Yeah. I knew some people in it that, were wealthy and that I'd known from school, but I knew a lot of people that, like like Lou or Dennis that rent Shrimper. I felt attracted to the kind of lack of elitism in a lot of that spaces.
Yeah, if you could get a guitar at a thrift store, you could learn it. Right, that was it. That was the barrier. My parents got me a $100 Stratocaster knockoff.
Yeah, same. Squire Bullet like, for me.
Yeah. It wasn't even a Fender. It was like, it just was shaped like a Fender.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
When I was like 15 and I could learn on that. So it was like, that's really the barrier. It's the same way a little bit in which like stand up is a lot more working class.
Yeah.
Because anyone can get up in front of a microphone. That doesn't mean you'll succeed, but just like, there's the barrier for entry into that is lower than a lot of other things.
Yeah, and that's a weird genre, and there's like so many comedians from Boston, and it's never was like a genre I knew a lot about, but I was always just like, wow, like there's so many, and that from but like it's definitely something that has the city I'm from, there was like a lot of comedians coming out of there. You know?
Yeah. You got David Cross, you got Mark Maron, you got Bill Burr, you got a ton of people.
But yeah, I think that, so there was some influence from my parents, but some departure. Yeah. But I think definitely kind of like, it's been really a great learning experience for me to be teaching in the district I am coming out of indie rock, just because it's, majority people of color district. And, and so I look at the learning that happens in my classroom as a two-way street, and just one of the few spaces left where people are sharing space and having conversations across these lines. And, it's pretty heavily surveillanced, I think, for that reason by by conservative forces in terms of the way they try and control what public school teachers do, because they don't really want Black and white and Latinx kids in the same classroom sort of finding out what their interests are in common. So they, for example, like there's very little time that we have to teach social studies. It's all like supposed to be skills. Like they just want them teaching them how to read and do math and like technical skills, so you can go like, work in a call center or like in a fulfillment, so it's like they don't, I used to have double the amount of time to teach science and social studies that I do now, and so, but, I think that, I just, there's certain things I appreciate about kind of education I had that my parents gave me access to, but I had to unlearn a lot from it as well.
Yeah. Well, do you think you grew up with class consciousness because you were in proximity to so many wealthy people but weren't wealthy yourself?
Yeah, I actually just taught a graphic novel called The New Kid that's about a kid that goes to Riverdale. It's just like the very fancy private school in the north of the Bronx of New York, that from Washington Heights. And I taught the book because I started out teaching in that unit a book that was set in the civil rights era and like desegregating, like restaurants in Nashville, and some of the Black kids in class were like, this book is really making me angry and I really don't like it. And I just talked to them I just asked them what they thought about why. And it turns out they're kind of like sick about hearing about the same 5-year period in Black history and over and over and over again. And I said, does reading about this like desegregation in the early 60s make you feel like there used to be this problem called racism and we don't have it anymore? And they're like, yeah, and that makes me mad. And I'm like, I've often felt that as a teacher, like, it's like they'll only talk about the early goals of Martin Luther King's life, not like the later goals about like, why he was in Memphis and what he was doing there. And but I think that, so I was reading this book. I was just like telling the kids, I was like, look, this kid's a Black kid going to majority white school. I was a white person going to a school like this, but all these scenes in this book ring really true to me about like, we would go, vacation would happen and people would come back really tan, be like, oh, I was just in the Caribbean. And my mother was very sarcastic and she would say things like, oh, well, we were vacationing at Laundryland, which was the laundromat, and like, my mother would like steal clothes from me out of the lost and found. Uh-huh. And she would, call the school she taught at Shady Deal, even though his real name was Shady Hill. And she would, but she also was very like elitist in some ways and like attached to that world because she didn't, and she'd taught in a public school for a year and didn't like the way she was treated. And, so it's just, I think that like there's an advantage to being around environments like that, which is that it can disabuse you of the notion that if you were like a millionaire, you would have a happy family because the kind of things that you have to do to get to the top in a lot of fields are basically antithetical to being a good parent because you're always working all the time. And so like I, knew a lot of really depressed rich kids that were materially advantaged but didn't get the kind of attention from their parents that I did because they were really ambitious and like, were really more about their careers. And so like, that doesn't mean to say that they weren't hugely privileged and advantaged and I wasn't mad about stuff, but I also think that, you can really believe the hype of thinking like, if I made it on Wall Street and stuff, then I'd have it, my life would be easy. And, there are, a lot of like the classic Hollywood canon of film noir has that element to it. And people debate like kind of, like Humphrey Bogart sort of in The Big Sleep or something like, kind of. And so, but I think it disadvantage was just not really feeling like totally fit anywhere, but also just seeing kind of like seeing different kind of parts of, different aspects of life that I, might have romanticized otherwise,
Yeah. I mean, was there a point in your life where that was the aim and then you're in this context and you see, oh, actually most of them seem very unhappy. So maybe I don't want to do something that is high paying, but that I wouldn't like.
I didn't entertain the possibility of doing something high paying till 2000 when I quit the folk Implosion. And like I said, I grew up like not really being mad at my parents at all, like because they were very culturally similar to me and spent a lot of time with me. And so I was never really like a teenage rebel, Mm-hmm. And I didn't really find out that about stuff I was pissed off about like my parents and stuff till I think music in some ways. I bottled it into music. And then when I started doing music full time, not like the lyrics or anything, but just like the content of it, like I kind of dredged up a lot of psychic shit for me, and so in the second half of my 20s, I started asking all these questions and I was like, fuck what my dad told me. I was like, I'm going to quit music and, become a lawyer. And my dad would be kind of like laughing at me. He would be like, I don't really think that's it. My girlfriend, we weren't together at the time, but I was talking to her around that time and we'd known each other since we went to school together. And she was like, I think she was just kind of like, this doesn't really seem like what you're saying you're going to do. But no, it wasn't until I turned 30 that I started to think, maybe I should do something like that. And I think it was like, I started to see people I know like getting married and having families. And I was, having a lot of anxiety issues being a full-time musician and just like, this isn't going to really. So I think it wasn't till I hit a lot of like resurgent feelings about my parents splitting up when I was really young in my late 20s that I started to really think, oh, if I was, rich, then I would be able to have like a happy nuclear family. Like I'm finding out that I actually did really want when I was a kid, when I thought I was fine with like being a bohemian, my dad would, in high school, I had this superiority complex about having grown up as a bohemian person, because a lot of people wanted to be indie rockers. And I was like, well, you know what? My dad really does stop by the side of the road and pick wood out of other people's garbage to build me a bunk bed. So I'm cooler than you. Or but I think the biggest thing I could have done to rebel against my parents would be to become like a corporate person. They would have been horrified if I'd done that. Yeah,
but you also wouldn't have been happy. It would have just been purely a kind of dialectical move against them, right? Yeah.
And I didn't, so, it didn't get too far. And so, but I think like, people who knew me almost thought it was funny when I was saying these things, and I wasn't, and obviously that didn't end up really happening. So, but yeah, it was kind of, this sense of like, I want to quit being a eccentric weirdo artist and like be a normal person with a family. And then like,
yeah,
I had to kind of like realize that wasn't really who I was either. So,
well, did you identify a want in you, and you kind of, or did you see other, like you said, you saw other people getting married and having kids, and you were like, I guess I should do that? Like, I ask that because I think when I was younger, I just assumed there wasn't even like, I couldn't even like identify what I really wanted, but I just assumed, I guess I'm just going to just, have a family and kid. I guess I'll do that. But like, there was never any real want. I mean, up until like I met my wife, like I didn't even, I guess I just assumed I would get married, but I didn't like, it wasn't something I was like actively interested in. Until I met someone who I'm like, oh, I do want to spend the rest of my life with this person. Right. Like there wasn't like, there was the deep desire came when I discovered when I started playing music with my friends in college, and I'm like, oh, this is the thing. Or, when that then transformed into sketch, and that transformed into writing comedy and that kind of stuff, right? I'm like, oh, right, this is the, like, I guess this is it. I had to feel it in my body before I had the intellectual epistemological thing. And I that's what I'm curious. I guess I'm asking about your experience. Was it just something where you saw other people and you're like, I guess that, or like what was going on inside you?
I think I just had this resurgent thing of like, my parents got divorced when I was 4, and I kind of put on this facade that was okay and everything, and I used to even like diss people. Like I remember like a Veruca Salt record came out, and they were like, this angsty post-punk music comes out of their like feelings about their parents' divorce, and I was like, man, that's just something like middle-class white people say to like get people to get attention, make people feel sorry for them. I was like, all right, have stuff that's relationships are, they come and they go. People have kids, they get divorced. So what? It's not a big deal. If you'd said when I was 24, I don't know, whenever that Veruca Salt album came out, that I would have still said that. And then like a few years later, some things happened to me, and then it was almost like this ghost from 1974 occupying my body and being like, I really wanted to have like, this, kind of stay family. I didn't really want to bounce back between houses every week, and I wanted to, and I think I also, and so I think it came from that, and then like projecting that onto friends I knew that were marrying and settling down, and I'm really lucky to know someone, that my partner now, who's known me through those different phases. So she knows that when I was in college, and we weren't dating in college, but I was dating a really good friend of hers, and that like I wasn't a very good boyfriend back then because I really just wanted to do music. Mm-hmm. The idea of like having a family or being in a relationship was like completely a distant second for me. I didn't even really think about it. I didn't think like I'm going to have a family. I want to get married. When I was like, 20 or 23 or whatever, I spent all my time getting to do what we're here to talk about, which is like doing things like the folk implosion. Then I think later I ended up feeling like, oh, did I just do this because I didn't have any confidence in relationships that they would work out because of the way I was brought up, and so I can just sing about. It started to seem weird just to be like singing about relationships, to audiences, and then not really like being in one. Like when I didn't really have an audience in the beginning, that didn't really bother me, But I think like when we got a little bit popular there for a while, and there was that kind of teeny bopper thing going on of like we're on MTV, and people were like, oh, you're so photogenic and all this stuff. And it was just weird. It was just like, I'm singing about, there are all these songs that we have that are about these romantic relationships, but it's never really been a real, am I just a fake? I just was like, I just was a weird imbalance. So I think that like kind of, I think also just the content of the music, pop music has that sort of gravity to pull towards romantic relationships that I try to fight that gravity in a lot of ways, but it is there, So I think that it
comes from somewhere, because I think about that. You're not that much older than me, but enough that I think it's a generational difference where I think your generation, like I think of your generation as the ice storm generation, parents getting divorced, like realizing that the suburbs are not the thing and like feeling existentially strange and like not knowing what to do. And then your influences are coming from, I guess, the generation before, in the same way that like I write a lot about divorce, even though my parents' generation wasn't getting divorced really. Like my parents are still together, and a lot of my friends' parents are still together. Yet all the stuff from the 70s, like listening to Paul Simon when I was a kid and listening to him every song about divorce or something like that, I'm like, oh, okay. So like that's in my
Kramer
head.
versus Kramer.
Yeah, right. In the same way that like whatever the generation before, like I don't know, Beach Boys or something that you're listening to when you're a kid.
Yeah.
And it's all happy-go-lucky relationship stuff is in your head, even though your parents went through like some weird relationships, not specifically your parents, but like in the 70s.
My generation, yeah.
Yes.
Well, it was like that. I mean, my mother's often said, just it was like discovering that you could light a fire. It's like that you could get divorced. And she was just like, man, at that time, it just was like people were figuring out, wait a minute, I don't just have to stay here. It's like I can get divorced. And then just, all of a sudden, she just was like, everyone was getting divorced and asking all these questions about like, how much of this was something I really wanted to be in a marriage like this for something that, it's not so far ago that my mom would say, like when she was in school, it was like you were supposed to look pretty and wait for someone to choose to marry you. You weren't supposed to like plan to have your own, maybe you had a career for a little while, but like it was really like compulsory. And I know people that are my age that also grew up with that, but I did not. It was divorce was more the norm for people I knew. And that neighborhood at that time, it was very like kind of, I think that also went along with like, kind of, you were at the tail end of like protests about the Vietnam War, and the neighborhood I spent the first half of my childhood in was a mix of kind of like hippies and black folks in Central Square of Cambridge. And that was, saw a lot of both cooperative racial interaction and hostile racial interaction. And Boston's pretty segregated generally, but that neighborhood was one of the few that was not totally segregated. And, later I moved to more like majority white neighborhoods and when I was older, but like in second half of my childhood. But that was like really, it was just a time when a lot of things were open to question, and, there were, and like you said, I think the aesthetics that were around were related to that, like, just was lucky to get exposed to different things, like my mom taking me to see The Harder They Come in like 1975, or, as a solo kid, or just like, just, it's the sense that music was important culturally in the neighborhood I grew up in.
When you were younger, you said you were about 4 years old when they got divorced?
Actually, I used to think I was 2 until my mother read an interview like this with me, and she said, you were not 2, you were 4. So for years, I thought it was 2. I don't know why.
We all need our parents to fact check our interviews.
Yeah.
That's very
so I was lucky she was around. So yeah, somewhere back in there. I don't know. Before I started school, anyway. Yeah.
Like, because, 4, you're very young. At what age are you kind of, like, cognizant of what's going on? Like, obviously, you know that they're living separately. It seems to me that divorce is this kind of event that forces the adult world onto children.
Yeah.
Right? And you don't have to go through some traumatic kind of adult world impinging on childhood necessarily. You just have to have a divorce. Like you could be in like a upper middle class white neighborhood and everything's kind of just like, white picket fences, but then divorce now forces you to grow up a little bit. I don't know about at the age of 4, but like at what point are you like, does that kind of come crashing down into your life? And maybe it is at 4, but I'm curious.
I think the lack of money was more of an adult thing at that point. Like my mother hadn't become a teacher yet, and there was a while when we were on like food stamps, and my dad was just starting teaching. He didn't have a lot of money, and he was living in like he was living in attic of a friend of his who had a hoarding disorder. So it was like a really unstable feeling place to go over there. And he'd be and so I just remember my parents being not having a lot of money, like having a car with like holes in the floor of the car. And like, I'm not saying, I always had something to eat and they weren't unable to pay the rent, but like, so, I taught students that, didn't have things I had back then, but I think that, there was this sort of cliched story of like, I went out on this sidewalk as a little kid and I set up a little booth to try and sell my childhood drawings that looked like Mr. Potato Head Man,
Yeah.
And like trying to like kind of make up for that. And then I like ran back in the house feeling freaked out. So I think like I was just that was sort of impinging. I think like this sort of part about like what is a relationship, what does it mean to broke up was pretty much over my head at that point. And I think especially because they always superficially seemed to get along really well. So it's not like I'd seen them fighting a lot and it was like, oh, of course they're going to get divorced. I was like, wait, what? Kind of like, so I think, I've talked to a lot of different adults that have processed these things and every divorce is different. And when it surfaces for kids seems to be really different, and my partner has kids from a previous marriage. And so, it's something that I hear about through that and also just from working with kids. But I think, there is a sense that that's why sometimes things hit people later is because there's certain things that developmentally you just don't really understand yet. And a lot of times it's like when you start acting out, you have patterns and that sort of cliche in relationships. But I do think there's a sense in which we're encouraged in this sort of political kind of environment that we've been in this country to think of things we suffer from in our life as coming from the nuclear family and from divorce and like psychotherapy patterns. And I think as opposed to from larger socioeconomic kind of forces in the country.
Yeah.
And I think that's, when I think about like, why did I get like, depressed when I was in the folk implosion in the 90s or whatever, there's a side of it that has to do with things like that, of like relationship patterns and my parents and divorce. But then there's a part of it of just like kind of when we started to have this opportunity to cross over, just becoming more aware of like how corporate America works and also becoming more aware through the fact that we were potentially given this opportunity to turn a project we did that was influenced by hip hop into like a repeated commercially successful formula as opposed to trying it for a movie. And the way that a lot of people that were trying to recruit us and sign us to major labels would talk about hip hop and about race. And poverty was really kind of an eye opener to me. And, in the same way that my parents getting divorced and kind of opened me up to before I, to sort of certain things that were kind of like I hadn't thought about before probably, but wasn't ready to process. I think, being, what was I, like 25 when Natural One became a hit and sort of, it just was a side of life I didn't really have a lot of experience in of like, kind of, I'd been to private school and stuff, but a lot of the people that I was around in private school were university people, like being from Cambridge. So they were like professors. And I think now a lot of those schools are much more stocked with hedge fund managers' kids. And I think they're much more conservative now than they were when I went to schools like that.
Yeah,
but
I think so.
But back then I was just around, I just basically grew up around, a lot of people that were into books and academics, and so I think that, some of my friends' parents in school were business school professors, so I knew a little bit about that, but just like sort of to, kind of be going out to fancy restaurants with like record executives was and just sort of, just like we held out a long time, so that drug on for a long time, and they didn't give up very easily, which surprised me. I thought they would just like be like, oh yeah, whatever, you guys are flakes, we'll just move on. But they kept pursuing us for this 2-year period, and it was like, so I had met a lot of people like that, and they're quite different from each other, but just to kind of, that was the point when there was potentially still a lot of money involved with music. It was before the internet, and the amount of money that they had to spend on things like taking you out to dinner, or kind of like the amount of money that they would sort of implicitly promise that you could make was of a different order than most people would be exposed to today. And so that was really, it just was not something I sought out, but it was really an eye-opener just to sort of, hear how people talk and think that are working in those spaces that kind of, I'd be interested to hear more about your experiences writing for comedy and film, but that's just the people who manage like what we get to see on radio and TV and MTV those are positions that are watched carefully, I believe, by the corporate structure of the country. And so just to sort of see how they would talk about hip hop and stuff was really interesting to me.
But that's what it goes back to something I said earlier where I was like, I do think representation is important, but often the only thing that's allowed, especially in highly corporate contexts, and as things get more corporatized, that encompasses like all aspects of life at this point, but like art is muzzled representation, right? Like in the 90s, if I remember right, the only rap that was really allowed was stuff that like, oh yeah, well this comes out of South Central, right? I don't remember KRS-One or Tribe being pushed as hard as say Dr. Dre or Snoop or Biggie or whatever, right? I don't remember hip hop that showed a diversity of the black experience being pushed as hard as one kind of black experience that fit a white stereotype.
Some people, there's a YouTube channel I follow that had a show about like the history of like house and techno and how like those things also came out of black culture in the Midwest, but more of like a middle class black culture, and that those things weren't really going to be seized on by like big corporations to market to like prey on the fantasies and fears of like white America in the same way. And I also think that some people believe that there was actually a meeting between the people that own the private prisons and the prison system and the record companies, and some people think this is a conspiracy theory that they, when you had that rise of mass incarceration after the war in 80s and into the 90s, and they're deindustrializing the country, and they are like, what are we going to do with all these people we're throwing out of work? Well, let's just warehouse them in prisons, right? So some people think that there was a push to get record companies to market images of black criminality so that to make it to normalize people to the idea of like, the kind of mentality that got Trayvon Martin shot of like, if there's a black kid in a hoodie walking through the neighborhood, they must be like one of those thugs I see on MTV, so I'll just shoot them, and so I think that they're not going to put they're not going to make Dead Prez or Saul Williams, on the top 10.
What's crazy is just that like you don't even have to have a conspiracy theory. You could just say like, I mean, I'm sure you've met some of these people where it's just like, no, like the people making decisions are rich white men, and it's so cliche to say it, but it's true, and they just don't know, or like the only like they whatever has filtered over to them from culture, so they're like, I guess that's what black people are, so then that's what they then greenlight. And so you only get one, you get what a rich white person thinks is. And that's some part of black culture, but they think that's these guys think it's the sum total, and so that's all that they allow to be.
I think that goes all the way back to the blues. I mean, I was just listening to this podcast, the history of rock music and 500 songs, and there's some episodes that's like, I don't want to listen to this podcast, I don't care about this or that artist, but a lot of the episodes aren't really about they're more about the influences of some of these people. So like there was an episode on Cream that had a large part about Robert Johnson.
Okay.
And one of the points he makes in that podcast is that a lot of performers like Charlie Patton and Robert Johnson had a really wide repertoire in their live shows that included lots of different genres of music. But white record executives would only record them doing what we now call like the blues. But and then that became very marketable, and so there's like a filtering, you know, and I think that but I think that there are I think that, you know, there's a book I have on my shelf here, but I think that you know, in the same way that the Pentagon does actually meet with Hollywood studios to
yes, for sure,
to foster content that, you know, promotes, you know, us being an empire, and that the, you know the amount of people that become famous by playing CIA agents, whether it's, you know, Claire Danes or like, you know, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, or like, you know, whatever Ben Affleck's, what was his wife?
The Accountant.
Name?
Oh, his Alias.
Alias, you know, just like, you know, that's the Bourne Identity, you know, just a sort of like, you know, I think there is a sort of use of mass media to promote things like, you know, militarism and, you know, images of sort of criminalizing black youth and stuff like that. So I think I think it's a mix of both. I think that you are dealing with kind of individual people, and having met some of those people, you know, and you know, you know, we did have a meeting with Sylvia Rohn, who at the time was the only person of color to be heading a major label, you know, but like to be Sylvia Rohn in that position, it was cool because she was like, they had an office pool going, and she was like, I think Missy Elliott's going to get big. And no one else at Elektra agreed with her. We loved her, and we were like, oh, I think we hope you're right. And then she did, and it was sort of like, but you know, you could see that like to get to that position in terms of like representation, she was like, you know, this band isn't willing to do what it takes to win. So she said about us, which is in some ways a fair assessment, I think. But, you know, like, you know, you have to be in it to win it, you know, to get to that level, you know. And I think that, you know, there was a window of time kind of like in the 60s and the 90s when some things that, you know, had become hits that, you know, were more like creatively organic or whatever. And there was a time when you could get a lot of things got signed that shouldn't have probably gotten signed, you know, you know, but, you know, then that window closed around the time that we broke up, and, you know, the sort of Disney kind of pop thing kind of came in.
Yeah.
But everything comes back around. You know, I remember we were doing an interview and one part Lullaby came out, and they were like, how are you guys surviving when indie rock is dead? You know, and Lou was like, well, maybe if you say it is, you know, but Lou was like saying, you know, doesn't everything come back? You know, we've learned that. And, you know, and then like a few years later, you had like the Strokes or the, you know, the Yeah-Yeahs or whatever.
Right.
I remember seeing the White Stripes on TV the first time they were on, like when they did like, I can tell that we are going to be friends, you know, that song. And I was just kind of like, oh, that's interesting that someone like this is, you know, I guess they told us this was all dead. And, you know, so I don't know. It's just it's a slippery slope, you know, these trends and what gets popular and stuff. But but yeah, it was just a weird time and to sort of, that it's hard to imagine. It's a totally different situation today. I mean, like, people are so desperate to make any money doing this, you know, like.
Yeah. I mean, just to sew up some stuff, we're right at the very end. You know, I mean, one of the reasons why I do concentrate more on kind of psychoanalytic existential stuff is I think the class stuff tends to limit your horizons, or it can in your mind at least. Like, you know, again, I grew up just assuming there were certain things I could do or couldn't do just based on I was middle class. I'm like, well, I'll never do this thing, but at least this whatever is in my horizon of possibilities. I do think the psychoanalytic stuff and especially like how your parents influence you or the people around you influence you, though, gives you the array of choices within that boundary that the class stuff creates.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm more like, sometimes I tend, even though
okay, I was wondering, it's not just that we got on this kind of psychoanalysis that you are looking at that,
even though I do think the class stuff is extremely important, I tend to think that it is secondary in many cases to the family stuff, because that gives you the examples, right?
Yeah, and so I think that, my parents definitely, like, they, till the day my dad died, or till, my mom's still alive, they wrote things, they wrote poetry. They weren't musicians, but like they wrote and they made things at stuff and at home, and and also some of the like anti-commercialism, and like that, I remember like my dad had a friend who they would, do creative writing projects and share them with each other, and it's like, even to publish something is like, you shouldn't do that. Like, it's like, it's just like a private expression that you share culturally with people, and I think that, I think my dad was kind of like having an indie rock fan for a dad. Like, he really loved Take a Look Inside, because it was sort of zany and kind of slapstick, and he'd liked, Freak Out by the Mother's Invention was one of his favorite albums, so like that kind of like Susie Cream Cheese, What's Gotten Into You, kind of parody of like, and so like I think he really liked, stuff like Slap Me and, Sputnik's Down and stuff. And then when we did the kid stuff, he was like, "Oh, this is really good, but I don't like it as much as your first record." It's kind of like, so there's a sense of like, or like I remember once I was like watching the Super Bowl, and like Sting and No Doubt were playing, and I was like, oh, maybe if we do well on Interscope or signed Interscope, we'll be there. He was just like horrified. Like, I was just like, he was like, how could you even say that? It's just like, and of course that was not realistic, but I mean, it's just like that there was a sort of sense of like that, similar. I heard like an interview with like Kim Gordon once where she was talking about like growing up in a similar kind of probably like, book reading kind of school people thing of like, doing things for artistic reasons was encouraged, but like at the entertainment industry and like that was frowned on, and so like, I think there was a, and I sensed that, that was a very personal thing to me, and was something that, then when we had these sort of opportunities we're seen as having opportunities to sort of become more genuinely sort of a crossover type thing was, the way I kind of reacted to against that had a lot to do with my upbringing.
Was there some example in your life that showed you could play music for a living, or you could do it at a professional level, or was it just kind of just the time, the era where you could fall into it?
Depends what age you're talking about. I think, when you're talking about the early 70s, in the neighborhood I was living in, we didn't really know musicians, but there was a sense that people that I would see on like Bob Dylan or Van Morrison album covers looked like people that were walking around my neighborhood, and that like, the Astro Weeks album like references Cambridgeport, which was the neighborhood I was living in then. And so that seemed like, but I think that, and then when I got to high school, like the Lemonheads were starting,
Right.
And then when I got to college, a couple friends of mine got in bands that were signed by Drag City and Sub Pop, before the Folk Implosion started, which is Six Finger Satellite and the Palace Brothers, but I think that really college radio, I think, is what made it seem more accessible to me, because so many people that I knew or that were older brothers and sisters of people I knew were college radio DJs. And so, you could get into shows at this club called the Middle East as an underage person. So I just went to see so many shows in high school of people that were making records and touring that were obviously not, it just seemed very natural to step into doing that. And it didn't seem that distant, I think. But I think like in terms of like having a hit like Natural One, that I had no model for.
Yeah.
I think that came more out of just like my mom really liking, the Bee Gees. my mom just like her, like my mom, my dad would have never listened to Saturday Night Fever or stuff like that, or, but my mom, and I think also came out of like, hearing like De La Soul and Public Enemy in high school and just being introduced to sampling through 3 Feet High is Rising and It Takes a Nation of Millions to Hold Us Back. And the first Run DMC record. Those are the 3 hip hop albums that made me interested in like drum machines and sampling, in addition to like I'd always grown up around guitar music.
John, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Taking the time out of your precious weekend to talk
Vanishing,
to me.
Yeah. Thanks so much. Yeah. It's been fun.
I really appreciate it.
And it's great to hear about you wearing the hats out when you all were striking back a couple of years ago. And congrats on all that work.
Thank you. We seemingly won.
I tell students when we study like things in history and conflict, it's like arm wrestling. It just goes back and forth. There's no end to it.
Right. We win, and then the minute we have the contract signed, it's like, all right, what are going to be the gains for the next contract? What are we looking for the next one?
That's been like, I've worked with the teachers union here for 10 years, and it's we win things, and then they don't follow through on promises, and then you have to keep fighting. So
yep. Yeah.
It's a lot. It's an uphill battle.
Yeah. And we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye, oh, 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 bye.